Hello, everyone. I would like first to thank to John Ricoin, the Institute of Fine Arts, the Canadian Centre for Architecture, and of course Princeton University for giving us this opportunity to present our work here. In July 12, 1938, Il Giornale d'Italia, a national newspaper founded in 1901 and increasingly close to fascist ideological interest during the late 1920s, started an unbalanced discussion under the heading Per l'autarchia politica dell'architettura, for autarky, politics of architecture. Autarky, a state model that bases its mode of production in national material self-sufficiency, was the economic cornerstone of the fascist regime during the second half of the 1930s. Material availability constitutes an important foreground that has quite often been understudied. The consequences of the official economy on architecture were significant. Autarky soon became the battlefield of aesthetics and ideological agendas between architects supporting the modern movement and those ones with a biased, idealized, and traditional idea of national identity. The initial intention of the journal was to publish 3 articles written by the Roman architect Marcello Piacentini, analyzing both the present situation of architecture and the way the discipline should undertake the official economic guidelines. Nonetheless, the numerous reactions to Piacentini's opinion made the editor enlarge the extent of the discussion. 15 articles were published, all of them during the summer of 1938, providing the Italian audience a seemingly fair debate about the relationship between politics, economics, and aesthetics. Relevant figures of Italian architecture, such as Gio Ponti, Salvatore Cardella, Pierluigi Nervi, Carlo Broggi, or Lodovico Quaroni, presented their opinions alongside propagandistic editorials, technical reports, and popular accounts. The search for economic independence in an increasingly unsteady international environment intensified the bitter discussion among architects about the different interpretations of the rationalist heritage and its political and aesthetic future developments. By 1938, the question of autarky was a pressing political concern. The military invasion of Ethiopia, the 3rd of October of 1935, by the fascist regime had considerable consequences for Italy's imperialist and economic aims. 4 days after the conquest, the League of Nations imposed economic sanctions, understanding the Italian invasion as an international act of aggression. Fascist Italy had been preoccupied with economic self-sufficiency and state intervention since Mussolini's access to power in 1922. But after 1929's global crisis, the emphasis on national autonomy increased. The most worrisome aspect of Italian economy and industry was its lack of coal and iron resources, indispensable for the development of a modern army. The omnivorous appetite of war industry intensified the already chronic material shortage. During the second half of the 1930s, engineering and military industry were to demand a larger amount of iron, whereas steel, for building purposes, stalled or even diminished. Meanwhile, prices were increasing. Even though the international blockage after the Italian invasion didn't last long, sanctions ended on July 15, 1936, the government launched a series of measures to assuage the energetic and material national deficit. At the same time, mobilization towards military production was taking place. In order to counteract the situation, the Italian government advised against the use of coal and iron in non-strategic sectors and started a campaign to obtain the required currencies for international commercial trades. On 23 March 1936, Mussolini addressed Italians from the Assemblea delle Corporazioni, the Assembly of Corporations, warning of the perhaps inevitable forthcoming war and the need to further intensify state presence in the market, not to nationalize or bureaucratize, but to manage and control the correctness of its industrial and economic pace. In 1938, the Istituto per gli Studi di Politica Internazionale in Milan published a document written in English for external consumption entitled Autarky. I would like to call the attention that, there's a very interesting mistranslation of the word autarky, since autarky, in the sense that the Italians are referred to, is with K, and autarky with CH means despotism. The document clearly summarized the intentions behind the economic decisions. Autarky was presented as a maneuver of national reaffirmation in order to safeguard political interest. Quote, The essential character of autarkic policies cannot be explained by merely showing the connection between the tendency to secure greater self-sufficiency shown by all countries and the post-war trend toward a planned economy. The real explanation is to be found in the fact that all efforts at economic self-sufficiency aim not only at satisfying economic needs, but at securing national political independence. It is only when the connection between economic and political need is understood that autarkic policies become comprehensible. End quote. Ideology and economic were hand in hand. To liberate the government from foreign dependence would jettison unwanted political compromises, allowing Mussolini to proceed according to his own belligerent agenda. The Italian regime hid itself behind the tendency among industrialized nations to protect their market after the Great Depression, no matter what agreements of liberalism were signed in previous years. The movements made by Germany and followed by Italy in that direction were mandatory, according to the Italian pamphlet, to both guarantee and promote political integrity to justify the otherwise unacceptable conquest. Although the greatest battles to be fought in national terms were, according to the publication, the re-education of population and the adaptation of large economic sectors in order to face the complex and delicate international situation. Quote, "It is becoming apparent that autarky not only requires the mobilization of all productive activities and the utilization of the low-grade raw materials available in the country. It is above all a question of ingenuity in discovering new uses for available economic resources, and this calls for a radical modification of consumers' tastes, which will be secured by the active propaganda carried on in favor of economic self-sufficiency. Therefore, our people are learning to eat more fish and less meat, to use tinned foods which can be prepared in abundance from homegrown fruits and vegetables, to reduce to a minimum the use of structural steel and iron in the building trades, and to increase the use of synthetic products." End quote. The efforts to re-educate the population were conspicuous in the multiple exhibitions that the regime organized. In architecture, autarky provoked significant changes in building regulations in order to reduce the 10% of the actual cost of the building that was dependent on imports. In November 1937, the use of reinforced concrete was forbidden for buildings less than 6 stories. The decision was extended in February 1938 to all housing buildings, disregarding its height, and finally in September 1939 to all kinds of buildings. One of the main consequences of the new economic situation was this ideological identification in the use of materials. Modern materials like iron or steel were promptly stigmatized as anti-national, whereas the use of stone or marble became widely encouraged. National and autochthonous values came to the fore thanks to the official sponsoring of local materials as well as newly created ones. National wood was used for fiber panels, chipboards, or plywood. Chemical developments contributed with new materials such as the composite panel, whereas the use of aluminum became widely promoted. To compete in such a politically difficult market meant quite often to highlight the national or autarkic character of the material in industrial advertisements. Magazines such as Casabella, Cuadrante, Reseña, or Domus were already concerned during the first half of the 1930s about the relation between architectural image, formal language, and material articulation. But once autarky was introduced, the dispute between those architects that saw in modern techniques and products a threat to Italian traditional architecture and those ones embracing the formal and intellectual basis of modern movement became increasingly harsh. The magazine Reseña di Architettura founded in January 1938 a series of installments under the heading Tecnica edile, building technique, as a conservative technical section supporting official positions. The opening article by the future Minister of Labor Giuseppe Gorla, entitled Autarchia nelle costruzioni edili, Autarky in Building Constructions, started by quoting Mussolini, quote, "The whole nation must have an autarkic mentality," end quote. Gorla affirmed that the use of metals in construction had to be subordinated to military national urgencies. Imported wood was also to be avoided, as well as coal, while the compulsory use of local materials should be seriously encouraged. Stone stood as the privileged material to be used in, quote, "the works that fascism will leave for posterity as a memory of its heroic time," end quote. The aim of the article was to impose a mentality that predisposed towards what Gorla called an autarkic mystique, a kind of mystique that worshipped the inner, local, and traditional product above commodities imported from foreign nations. Casa Vela quickly responded to Reseña's new technical edition with its own one. The magazine launched a series of essays in April 1938 to counteract and dispute the official recommendations against the use of metals. Giuseppe Pagano, the editor of the magazine, together with Eduardo Persico until the latter's untimely death in 1936, initially faced the physical aspect of rationalist architecture by defending the modern use of material rather than the use of modern materials. But once autarky was officially adopted, Pagano became one of the most vociferous defenders of the use of steel as indispensable material expression of modern architecture. It was not just a question of defending metallic constructions, but rather an attack on conservative positions that could jeopardize the road taken by avant-garde architects up until then. Despite the technical laziness of the discipline and the mental inertia of artisans, the rational use of iron would fundamentally contribute to the autarkic effort while aesthetically responding to the current times. A very familiar aesthetic, by the way. The engineers Umberto Ferrari, Ignazio Bartoli, Roberto Einaudi, Ercole Galassini, and Fausto Massi presented numerous technical articles with statistical and economical information depicting steel as autarkic material. But defending steel from the threat of ostracism from construction also meant stepping into some paradoxical terrain. It was not about consuming less steel, but about reducing cost in Italian constructions. The argument was in tune with fascist specifications. Nevertheless, the coupling between autarky and austerity cannot necessarily be inferred from desires for economic autonomy. Naively, the editors and collaborators of Casa Vela thought that demonstrating the appropriateness in the use of steel would influence official policies. Unfortunately, the steel available in the country was needed to fulfill military needs. The debate in El Giornale d'Italia took place within this political and aesthetical milieu. The aim of the discussion was to defend a national style better suited for the political and economical interest at the doorstep of the Second World War. Carlo Tridenti introduced the topic by stating that the fight between architecture and aesthetics should better be understood in economical and technical terms. Once the use of steel was officially limited for construction purposes, the abundance of stone resources, marble in particular, advised to treat the autarkic endeavor from both the point of view of respect towards past historical traditions, but also as a sign of obedience to present national material needs. The introduction advocated for a compromise between fantasy and an updated historical pride of simplicity without cultural obstinacy. The first article of Marcello Piacentini appeared in July 13, 1938, and the last one just 4 days later, in July 17. Throughout them, Piacentini developed a conservative, historicist, and racial concept of architecture that supported and justified a national aesthetic agenda. Piacentini found some of the achievements generally attributed to the modern movement, such as the transformation of structural and compositional elements, already present in the Italian stili floreale. Modern architecture meant for Piacentini a return to reality as representation, as deployed by the correspondence between construction elements and its function, specifically in the genuine use of stone and marble. Piacentini's argument shifted towards more ideological aspects in his second article. The problem was that rational architecture betrayed the regional character of Italian architecture. According to Piacentini, quote, "The political event destined to produce the most overwhelming consequences from the war on is the affirmation in the totalitarian countries of national values as a reaction to the disintegrating movements of internationalism." End quote. Piacentini advocated for a neo-Renaissance, a return to the essential values of Italian classicism in order to provide the Italian cultural milieu with a secure basis in which to ground a new language in tune with past traditions and new challenges. The arch and the vault were among the semantic elements to be rescued from the past, abandoning therefore the pure and cold rationalism represented in reinforced concrete and steel constructions. Autarky was the agent meant to fulfill the spiritual aim of the Italian architectural rebirth and to balance the criteria for the national and rational use of past elements within the excellent Italian techniques. The very materiality followed for Piacentini, quote, "the political and spiritual factor of the Italian race," end quote. Past buildings, as Il Duomo di Milano or la Basilica di San Marco, were the most conspicuous representations of autarky in Italy, since they were built with local materials, mainly available around the construction site. There was nothing austere in Piacentini's example, but rather a celebration of the exuberant national tradition. Self-sufficiency was evolving towards self-representation. The reduction of the span between columns and the openings in the facade, the adjustment of the building dimensions to a multiple of equal elements, and of course, the use of stone and marble were among the final aesthetic recommendations of Piacentini in order to pursue the appropriate aesthetic representation. He also advocated for adopting legal measures that would require that a fixed percentage of or marble be used in every building, while promoting the ban of the use of steel columns for buildings smaller than 6 stories. This figure perhaps might ironically explain why his proposal for the Palace of the Italian Civilization in the E42 sector, a concrete domino-like structure built between 1938 and 1943 and completely enveloped with arches and vault, has a 7th underdeveloped and probably unnecessary floor. Piacentini's article soon triggered reactions among the readers of the journal, and new opinions were published. Gioponti criticized Piacentini's nostalgic bourgeois return to marble as a surreptitious attempt to provide symbolic and social status for a decadent social class. Instead, the term autarky should correspond with the protection of fantasy and artistic predominance of national designers and artisans. Ponti's notion was also nationally biased. Autarky entailed law and pride, discipline and conquer, sacrifice and ambition, plus a faith in the inner possibilities of the Italian nation. 2 days later, Pierluigi Nervi was less ambiguous and more technologically oriented according to modernistic drives. The best way to overcome the stylistic problem, wrote Nervi, is by simply ignoring it. More meaningful for future developments was the opinion of a young Lodovico Quaroni, who advocated for wall-supported architecture, architectura muraria, as a compromise between the construction reality of the country and its material needs. Quaroni proposed low-tech empiricism in order to solve autarkic struggles. But Marcello Piacentini was not alone. Among the many partisans of Italian material tradition was Carlo Broggi, who summarized his notion of autarky in Il Giornale with the following sentence: "Our materials, our structure, and our architecture." For Broggi, the use of reinforced concrete diminished the eagerness to explore the compositional play present in the Italian masterpieces of the past. The concrete was bringing a monotonous uniformity to Italian architecture that was present in other countries. Therefore, the use of concrete had to be restrained just for a few absolutely necessary cases. Broggi's nationalist opinion is the most significant, since he was, together with Paul-Henri Nenot, Camille Lefebvre, Julien Flegenheimer, and Joseph Bagot, the winning architect of the remarkable 1920 competition for the Palace of the League of Nations in Geneva. However, the most implacable defense of stone as autarkic and ideological material was done by the architect and professor Salvatore Cardella. The problem for Cardella was that rational fundamentalism brought a kind of construction anemia by burying the structural resistant elements, and therefore was incapable of properly representing the strength and forcefulness of the fascist regime. Stone, a superbly classic and glorious national material, not only fulfilled the autarkic directions, but also matched the appropriate expression for the architectural ideal of Italy. The reconquest of stone in Italian architecture was the inevitable offspring of autarkic directions, helping to determine the indispensable vocabulary for the national architectural language. Not surprisingly, this new architecture did very much resemble the old one. The final conclusions of the discussions were presented by the editor of Il Giornale himself in August 14. Virginio Gaida asked rhetorically, quote, "How can and must Italian architectural thinking be undertaken? With what means and methods and with what spirit and raw materials? How can, therefore, a typical Italian architecture be created, alive and comprehensive, expression of its own environment without being outside of its own time?" End quote. The response was clear. By now, all great architects, as well as other great Italian artists, have recognized the need to return to the Italianness of every art. The term Italianità was standing, according to Gaida, for, quote, a racist affirmation as a result of instinct, experience, and practical development, end quote. The thread was the international culture present in the Italian territory, quote. Internationalism doesn't produce art, nor national or universal. Internationalism serves just ephemeral, standardized fashion without beat or physiognomy, end quote. Therefore, the official autarkic policies had to explicitly and messianically reverse the situation by accommodating not only national, but also international targets. On a national level, quote, autarky is needed in order to build with Italian raw materials, reducing to the minimum the imports of foreign materials, and also to build using Italian means and processes, as well as with Italian spirit and aims, end quote. In an international level, autarky was intended, quote, to prepare the world in order to retake the export of Italian architects, that is, of Italian intelligence. To this one, the export of stone and marble, as well as other materials, will soon follow, end quote. Obviously, Gaida had a particular unidirectional notion of internationalism. Giuseppe Pagano responded to Piacentini with two articles entitled both Variazioni sull'autarchia architettonica, Variations around Architectural Autarky, published in Casabella in September and October in 1938. According to Pagano, the only space that Piacentini and his followers defended were the spurious spheres of tradition, a conservative place for fixed values and habits that hampered the future development of the national economy. The fascist attitude was indirectly questioning the industrial capabilities of the nation. The problem of a poorly understood autarky was its technical and economical future heritage, since the lack of research in that direction would compromise and jeopardize the crystallization of new technological developments. Autarky was for Pagano just an economical and technical problem, and the fact that just 10% of the building cost was destined to foreign markets proved that building industry was one of the least costly burden for the fascist regime. The attitude of Giuseppe Pagano and Pierluigi Nervi evidenced the intricate relationship between modern movement and the free international market. The emphasis in highlighting autarky as a question of cost reduction was targeted towards the availability of material and techniques required for the development of rationalist architecture. After the political interference, three main trends could be identified among Italian architects. The first one rendered autarky as a source for national and fascist representation through the use of traditional, though sometimes expensive, materials. The second one understood autarky as a traditional shift towards popular and austere proposals according to the technological capabilities of the nation. These two standings represent the ludic character of Italian pre-war architecture. Finally, the third one understood the economical endeavor in technical terms, reducing the expenses of the overall construction without necessarily altering either the aesthetic or the material values of the modern movement. On this side of the spectrum, it seems that a passionate defense of rationalist architecture necessarily entails a partial abandonment of the concept of autarky. It is true that the use of steel was slightly more costly than the use of traditional materials, but the figures and studies seem so broad and ideologically loaded that becomes difficult to defend the use of materials just in economical terms. The Italian historian Sergio Poretti has recently stated that, quote, the final causes of the failure of steel in that period was the difficulties to accommodate new techniques within the artisanal character of Italian construction, end quote. He's probably partially right, but as I have been trying to show, the discussion around the use of materials became ideologically loaded, determined by the political agenda and the need of the fascist regime to prepare the nation for the imminent war. The Second World War brought consequently a reduction of the free flow of commodities among industrialized countries, but without doubt, more could have been done in political terms to support the use and development of building technologies. Meanwhile, the battle for economic autonomy fought by the fascist government influenced architectural production in two different ways. First, by means of the political consciousness taken by architecture and its acknowledgement of the paramount relevance in fashioning the moral habits of populations. And second, by altering and determining the material availability, bringing forward austerity as an essential value. Materials and their technical use have their formal solution within the physical possibilities in a given cultural framework. Structural technologies, as well as final details, reveal industrial and cultural identities. This semantic capability of detail in architectural expression became the discursive axis for Italian post-war architecture. Unfortunately, fascist retaliations kept Giuseppe Pagano away from those developments. Thank you very much.